What happens when Paul McCartney stops mid-song, sets down his guitar, and stares at a woman in the audience? The Tonight Show studio went completely silent. Jimmy Fallon's eyes filled with tears. The Roots stopped playing. 30 Rock Studio 6B, a room that had seen everything, had never witnessed anything like this. The woman in seat 14C was about to change everything. 3 hours earlier, Margaret Sullivan had arrived at Rockefeller Center with a faded photograph in her purse. The 82-year-old woman from Liverpool had flown to New York against her doctor's advice. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks to live, but she had made a promise to someone 59 years ago, and tonight was her last chance to keep it. The show began like any other Tuesday night. Jimmy bounded onto stage, did his monologue, played games with guests. The energy was electric. The audience laughed. Everything was normal until Paul McCartney walked out. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. Paul carried his Hofner bass, the same one he played at the Cavern Club in 1962. He settled onto the stool, smiled at Jimmy, and began the opening chords of Blackbird. His voice, weathered but still powerful, filled the studio. Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Margaret sat perfectly still in her seat, clutching the photograph. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from recognition. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. 2 verses in, Paul's fingers slowed on the fretboard. His eyes had found someone in the audience. Row 14, seat C. He stopped playing completely. The silence was absolute. Jimmy looked at Paul, confused. The Roots exchanged glances. The audience held its breath. Paul McCartney, who had performed for millions across 6 decades, was staring at one woman with an expression no one could read. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "That photograph you're holding, where did you get it?" Margaret stood slowly. The house lights came up slightly. She held up the photograph, yellowed, creased, but unmistakable. Paul McCartney, age 22, standing outside the Cavern Club with a young woman, both laughing, both impossibly young. "My sister gave it to me," Margaret said, her Liverpool accent still thick after all these years before she died. Her name was Eleanor. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Paul set his guitar down gently. He walked to the edge of the stage. Jimmy followed instinctively, not knowing why, just knowing this was important. "Eleanor Reby," Paul said softly. "I've been looking for her family for 59 years. The story came out in fragments. Eleanor had been 19, working at a record shop near the Cavern Club in 1964. She'd given Paul refuge during a rainstorm. They talked for 3 hours about music, about dreams, about the future either of them could imagine. She'd made him tea. He'd played her a song he was writing, something about lonely people. A week later, Eleanor was diagnosed with leukemia. She died 6 months later before the Beatles became a phenomenon, before Paul could find her again, before he could tell her he'd finished the song. She made me promise," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face, "that if I ever met you, I tell you she heard it. She heard Eleanor Rybee on the radio 2 weeks before she passed. She knew you'd remembered. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." Jimmy's hand was over his mouth. Tears fell openly. The audience, 450 strangers, became witnesses to something sacred. Paul walked down the stage steps. Security moved to stop him, but Jimmy waved them off. Paul approached Margaret, took both her hands and his. "She changed my life," Paul said. "That afternoon in the record shop, she told me that the best songs were the ones that made lonely people feel less alone." I never forgot that Margaret reached into her purse, was shaking hands. She pulled out an old envelope, yellowed and fragile. "She wrote you a letter the day before she died, but she never got your address. She made me promise to find you. I've been trying for 59 years. Paul took the envelope. His hands trembled as he opened it. The audience couldn't hear what it said, but they saw his face crumble. They saw him read it twice, 3 times. Then he did something that broke every rule of television. Paul McCartney took off his guitar strap and handed Margaret his Hofner bass. "This was hers too," he said. "Every note I played on this, every song, she was there. She should have it." The entire studio erupted, not in applause but in something deeper. Jimmy Fallon walked over, tears streaming down his face. He put one hand on Paul's shoulder, one on Margaret's. The Roots stood. The audience stood. The cameras kept rolling, but this wasn't television anymore. This was witness. Margaret held the bass like it was made of light. She looked at Paul with eyes that had seen too much sorrow and not enough joy. "She knew," Margaret whispered. "In the hospital the last day, she said, 'He's going to change the world. Tell him I knew,' and you did. You changed everything." Paul embraced her. A hug that lasted 30 seconds, the kind of embrace that carries 59 years of missing someone, of wondering what if, of never getting to say goodbye. When they separated, Paul looked at Jimmy. Can we play it for Eleanor? Jimmy nodded, speechless. Paul picked up his acoustic guitar. He let Margaret keep the bass. He sat back on the stool. The audience was completely silent. Not the silence of waiting, the silence of reverence. "This is for Eleanor Raby," Paul said, "who taught me that music is how we find each other in the dark." He played Blackbird again, but this time every note carried weight. Every word meant something different. When he sang, "Take these broken wings and learn to fly," he looked at Margaret. When he sang, "You were only waiting for this moment to be free," his voice cracked. Jimmy stood beside him, hand on his heart. The Roots hummed harmony. The audience swayed. Margaret held the Hofner bass and closed her eyes. "Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten." After the song ended, Paul stood and walked back to Margaret. He knelt beside her seat. Paul McCartney, at 81 years old, on his knees in Studio 6B. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping the promise, for finding me, for letting me know she heard it." Margaret touched his face. "She loved you. Not because you were famous, because you were kind to a girl in a record shop on a rainy day." To speak. The show didn't continue with its normal schedule. Jimmy made an announcement that they were ending early. He invited the entire audience to stay as long as they wanted. Many stay for an hour, sharing tissues, sharing stories. Margaret passed away 6 weeks later in her home in Liverpool. Her family reported that she spent those final weeks with Paul's bass by her bedside. Paul attended the funeral via video call, playing Eleanor Raby one last time. What happened next changed The Tonight Show forever. In the weeks that followed, Jimmy dedicated an entire segment to untold stories. He called it The Faces We Remember. Audience members could submit stories about people who changed their lives but never knew it, people they never got to thank, people who vanished before they could say goodbye. The segment became the most watched recurring piece in Tonight Show history. Thousands of stories poured in, thousands of reunions happened, thousands of thank yous were finally delivered. But it all started because Paul McCartney saw a photograph and stopped playing his guitar. The deeper truth revealed itself slowly. 6 months after Margaret's death, her daughter contacted the show. She revealed something Margaret had never told Paul that night. Eleanor hadn't just worked at that record shop. She'd been a songwriter, too. She'd written dozens of songs, none of them ever recorded, all of them lost except for one. In the envelope Margaret had given Paul, the letter Eleanor had written before she died, there was something else, sheet music for a song called Lonely People. Paul spent 3 months working on it. He recorded it with the same musicians who played on Eleanor Raby. He released it with all proceeds going to leukemia research in Eleanor's name. The song went to #1 in 14 countries. Jimmy dedicated an entire episode to its premiere. Paul performed it live on The Tonight Show, sitting in the same spot where he'd stopped mid-song months earlier. This time, he played the Hofner bass. Margaret's family had returned it to him with a note. "Eleanor would want you to finish what you started." Jimmy introduced the performance with tears already in his eyes. "This is why we do this," he said. "Not for the laughs, not for the ratings, not for the viral clips, for this, for the moments when the walls come down and we remember we're all just trying to find each other." The performance was silent except for Paul's voice and the bass. No drums, no backing vocals, just the song Eleanor Raby had written in 1964 finally being heard. When it ended, Jimmy walked over and embraced Paul. Either of them spoke. They didn't need to. The legacy lives in unexpected places. Today, if you visit Studio 6B at 30 Rock, there's a small plaque on seat 14C. It reads, "For Eleanor and Margaret, who taught us that no story is ever truly lost, The Tonight Show changed after that night. Not in obvious ways, but in the way Jimmy approached every show. Before each taping, he walks through the audience, he looks at faces, he wonders about their stories. He learned something from Paul McCartney that night. Every person in those seats came from somewhere, lost someone, loved someone, promised someone something. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, if you stop mid-song and really look, you can see it in their faces. The Tonight Show isn't just entertainment anymore. It's a place where promises get kept. Paul McCartney still performs regularly. But now, before every concert, he walks to the edge of the stage and scans the audience, looking for faces, looking for stories, looking for the person who might be carrying a 59-year-old photograph and a promise. Jimmy Fallon still makes people laugh every night. But now, Between the jokes and the games and the celebrity interviews, he stops. He looks. He remembers that the most important moments aren't planned. They happen when someone has the courage to stop playing and pay attention. Eleanor died in 1964, unknown and unremembered by history. But on a Tuesday night in 2024 in a television studio in New York City, she became immortal. Not because of a song, but because of a promise kept by a dying woman and witnessed by millions. This is what leadership looks like. Not speeches, not grand gestures, not perfectly timed punchlines. Leadership is Paul McCartney setting down his guitar to honor a memory. Leadership is Jimmy Fallon letting the show stop so something real can happen. Leadership is recognizing when the script should be abandoned because life is offering something more important. That night, Studio 6B became a church. The audience became a congregation, and two legends, one musical, one comedic, became human. The story spread across every platform, not because it was produced or marketed or optimized for engagement, but because it was true, because it was real. Because in a world of curated content and manufactured moments, authenticity is revolutionary. 6 words written on the back of that photograph changed everything. She heard it. She loved it. Thank you. That's all Eleanor's sister Margaret wanted to say. 6 words she'd carried for 59 years. 6 words that made Paul McCartney stop playing. 6 words that made Jimmy Fallon cry. 6 words that reminded millions of people watching that human connection is still possible, even in a television studio, even on a Tuesday night, even when it breaks every rule. Jimmy Fallon learned something that night that changed his entire approach to hosting. The best moments can't be written. They can only be witnessed. And The Tonight Show became more than entertainment. It became a place where people could be seen, really seen. The way Eleanor saw Paul in 1964, the way Paul saw Margaret in 2024, the way Jimmy sees every audience member who walks through those doors carrying stories they think no one wants to hear. Everyone has an Eleanor, someone who changed their life and never knew it, someone who vanished before they could say thank you, someone who deserves to be remembered. That's what Jimmy Fallon represents now. Not just comedy, not just celebrity interviews, but the possibility that someone might be paying attention. That promises might still be kept, that 59 years isn't too long to say thank you. The ripple effect continues to this day. 3 years after that night, The Tonight Show receives an average of 2,000 letters per week from people sharing stories of promises they want to keep. Jimmy reads every single one during his prep time before each show. Some have been reunions. Others have been thank yous delivered too late but still meaningful. A teacher who inspired a now successful surgeon. A stranger who helped someone during their darkest moment. A friend who said the right thing at exactly the right time. The show created a dedicated website, promiseskept.show.com. Over 50,000 stories have been submitted. More than 1,200 reunions have been facilitated. The segment won 3 Emmy Awards. But more importantly, it reminded an entire generation that human connection still matters. Paul McCartney's bass guitar sits in a special case backstage at Studio 6B. Before every show, Jimmy touches it. A small ritual, a reminder of the night everything changed. The night he learned that the best television isn't planned, it's witnessed. Margaret's photograph hangs in his dressing room, Eleanor's face, young and smiling, frozen in 1964. A reminder that every audience member has a story, every face has a history, every person came from somewhere and is going somewhere else, and sometimes, if you're paying attention, if you stop the show and really look, you can see it all written in their eyes.